be a celebrity. So this guy, he really wants to be a celebrity. He likes the idea of fame, and he just really wants to be around celebrities. Now his name is Dr. Landy, and Dr. Landy is not a celebrity. He's a psychologist. And one day, he gets an idea for a crazy and controversial new type of therapy treatment. But we'll get to that. First, we gotta talk about the Beach Boys, the band who's touring the world and topping the charts. Specifically, we gotta talk about the lead singer, this guy, Brian. And Brian, he's kind of a musical genius, but unfortunately, he's got a lot of undiagnosed mental health issues. And at this time, he's touring around, he's soaking in the fame, and he's dealing with that rock and roll lifestyle. And it's a lot for the guy to handle. So he does what a lot of rock stars do. He starts using drugs heavily. And he gains a bunch of weight, and sometimes he has nervous breakdowns, and he's been hearing voices. And because of all this, he stops touring, and he stops recording with his band. Bro is just a mess. So one day, Brian's wife, who we'll just call wife, she gets worried about him, and she seeks out a psychologist to help. The psychologist ends up being Dr. Landy. And Dr. Landy, the guy who wants nothing more than to be around celebrities, he agrees to help. So he starts to work with Brian, and immediately he diagnoses him as a paranoid schizophrenic. And this diagnosis is important because it's the wrong diagnosis, but we'll get to that. Regardless, Landy starts helping Brian, and he puts him on this controversial new type of therapy treatment he came up with. It's an intensive 24-hour therapy program where he hires assistants to watch over Brian constantly, and he has him start a fitness routine, and he gets him to start eating better, and he gets him on medication. And for this experimental therapy program, he charges $10,000 monthly, which in today's dollars is about $58,000 a month. But after doing this treatment, Brian does slowly start to show signs of improvement. He gets more productive, his mood gets better, he starts socializing again. But then, after about a year in this program, Dr. Landy decides to raise his rates from $10,000 monthly to $20,000 monthly, which in today's dollars is nearly $110,000 a month for therapy. And so the Beach Boys manager, he sees this and he's like, oh, well, this is bullshit. And he fires Dr. Landy, like, done. And everyone just moves on. A few years later, Brian, he isn't doing so well again. He's back to abusing drugs and alcohol. His weight gets up to over 300 pounds. His mental health just spirals out of control. And he and his wife, they end up getting divorced. And at one point, he attacks a therapist, and he gets committed to a mental health facility for a few months. Like, it's going really bad for him. And eventually, Brian overdoses. And his family and his management team, they don't know what to do. So they agree to do the only thing that kinda worked for him in the past. They allow him to see Dr. Landy again. So they hit up Landy and they ask him to help. Landy agrees to take Brian as a patient again in his 24-hour treatment program, but this time he wants two things. One, he wants total control of Brian's affairs without interference from anyone. And two, he wants to charge a new, even higher fee, $35,000 monthly, which in today's dollars is about $114,000 a month. Damn. So the family reluctantly agrees, and Landy takes over, and he controls everything in Brian's life. All decisions Brian makes have to go through him. He's his legal guardian now, and he puts Brian on a strict...
If a man really hated ads, here's what he would do. Day 1, he would install Pi on his computer without spending a dime because it's 100% free. Day 2, he realizes how clean and clutter-free his browsing experience has been since he got Pi. He doesn't have to deal with annoying cookie pop-ups or targeted ads. Day 3, he can finally binge
exercise plan. He throws cold water on Brian in the mornings to wake him up. He padlocks the fridge so Brian can't get into it unless he lets him. But most importantly, he controls who Brian interacts with. And he isn't allowed to contact his friends or his ex-wife or even his kids. And not only that, he keeps Brian pretty drugged up too, on antipsychotic meds. So Brian's kind of a zombie at this point. And again, Dr. Landy has a team of assistants watching over him 24/7 assessment to make sure he's complying with all these new rules. But to be kind of fair, the treatment does seem to be working, I guess. I mean, Brian is technically sober now, and he's losing weight, and he's way over-medicated, so I guess he's not hearing voices as much as he was before. But here's where things get really messed up. Dr. Landy now controls all aspects of Brian's life. So not only is he charging Brian $1 million a year in monthly fees, but he is able to anoint himself as Brian's creative and financial partner. And he's able to negotiate himself a quarter of Brian's publishing royalties on some of the Beach Boys songs. So songs that Brian writes on, Landy is now earning royalties off of them, and he's able to name himself co-writer on a bunch of the songs that Brian writes. I mean, at one point, Landy even says, and I quote, "I influence all of Brian's thinking. I'm practically a member of the band." And then, when Brian starts working on solo material, Landy names himself executive producer on the solo albums, and he gets himself credited as a co-songwriter on a bunch of the songs. This dude is shady as fuck. But around this time, Brian is at a car dealership buying a car one day, and he meets this woman, Melinda. And they hit it off, and they start dating, and Melinda really likes Brian. However, once she gets close to him, she starts to see this crazy control that Landy has over his entire life, and she doesn't like it. She thinks it's unethical, which it is. So she starts raising hell, bringing it to everyone's attention. She even reports Landy to the state attorney general. And of course, Landy doesn't like her back. I mean, he doesn't like anyone getting in between him and Brian. So eventually, after she and Brian had been dating for about 3 years, Landy gets so mad at her that he forbids Brian from seeing her. I guess he's just like, you're not allowed to see her anymore. And he's Brian's legal guardian, so Brian just stops seeing Melinda. And eventually, after all this hell has been raised, Brian's family gets involved in all this, and they don't like what's going on. And at some point, they get a hold of a copy of a will that Brian had allegedly made out. And in this will, he states that if he dies, he's going to give Dr. Landy 70% of all his assets. 70%! And this is the last straw for everyone. They're not going to let Brian give 70% of everything he's earned to his shady therapist. So the family ends up suing Dr. Landy, and they file a restraining order against him. And this story blows up, and Dr. Landy has to go on TV and try and defend himself.
But Dr. Landy, there is a rule against that. It's against the code of your profession.
It's a rule that I can't explain it to you.
Now eventually, Brian's family wins, and the court bars Landy from ever contacting Brian again. Good. That same year, with Landy out of his life, Brian reconnects with Melinda, and they fall back in love, and they get married a few years after that. And eventually, she gets him reevaluated and gets his mental condition properly diagnosed. And doctors discover that he has not paranoid schizophrenia, but a schizoaffective disorder with a mild bipolar disorder, which is a different thing and is treated differently. And once they treat Brian properly and get him the right meds, he ends up doing a lot better. Good for him. And here's what he looks like now in real life.
Aside from editing videos and thumbnails, it's all about
educate over 200 million.
Well, one day, Don was suddenly found unalived. Why? So back when Don had nothing, his whole goal was to do whatever it takes to get rich. So he goes and he starts a dating service. But it quickly fails. And 2 months later, he files for bankruptcy. Then he sets up a little credit repair company, and he charges people to help repair their credit. The problem with that is it's a scam. When people sign up with Don's company, he doesn't repair their credit. He only gives them information on how to sign up for new high-interest credit cards, which would potentially put them right back into debt. So his customers get pissed because this is fraud. So the state sues him, a judge orders him to pay his victims back, and his credit repair business is ultimately shut down. Oh, but that doesn't stop Don. He is determined to get rich. So he starts another grift, and that fails. Then he starts yet another where he's selling 1-900 numbers, psychic hotlines and shit like that. So he starts advertising these 900 numbers in the newspaper. And this is where he learns that advertising, whatever grift he's doing, is gonna be the key to make him rich. So he does this and he really starts pulling in big numbers, allegedly over $50,000 a week. So he's finally getting rich. But for some reason, this just isn't enough for Don, and he wants to take it further and make more. And that is when he gets into the world of late night infomercials. And in these infomercials, Don always makes himself the star, and he starts off by selling those same 1-900 numbers.
Another way to make unheard of amounts of money is by getting your own 1-900 line.
But then he starts branching out into selling other garbage. But where he really gets traction is when he starts peddling people bullshit advice on how to get rich. Basically, he's selling get-rich-quick schemes. And this grift is definitely shady, but it's technically not illegal, so it really works for him. And he starts running these late-night infomercials all the time, like every night of the week. And soon he's selling his get-rich-quick schemes to hundreds of thousands of people. And suddenly, just like that, he and his business are allegedly worth over $40 million. Dude is killing it. And by this point, he's a household name. He even gets parodied on SNL, played by a young David Spade.
Hi, I'm Don Lapre, and I have a question for you.
And this success continues for years. And Don just keeps spending money and he keeps trying to expand his businesses. But over time, it slowly stops working like it used to. It seems like people are getting tired of his get-rich-quick schemes, and so his profit margin starts to fall. And at one point, his company's losing $500,000 a week, and he owes a bunch of money on back taxes, and he loses really big on a real estate deal in Mexico. And then one day, womp womp, poor Don has lost so much money, he has to get up in front of all his employees and break the news to them. All his companies that were once worth over $40 million have now gone bankrupt. But, as we saw before, bankruptcy is not gonna stop Don. He is gonna grift whoever he can to get rich again. So a year later, he comes up with his biggest scam yet. And he partners up with this guy, Doug Grant. And Doug Grant is a whole other shady character with a whole other backstory. But Don and Doug Grant, they get together and they decide to set up a company selling, of all things, vitamins. And they call it
The greatest vitamin in the world.
But despite its name, it's basically just a standard multivitamin. But that doesn't matter. Don knows he can get on TV and he can sell it. And that's exactly what he does. He goes right back to making those late night TV infomercials, starring himself selling these vitamins.
Our goal is to educate over 200 million people.
But here's where the whole thing gets shady. Don's not just slanging these standard multivitamins. He's making all kinds of claims about exactly what they're able to do. Like he claims these vitamins can cure diabetes and they can cure heart disease and that they prevent cancer. Spoiler alert, they don't. And not only are they making false claims, but Don and Doug Grant turn the whole thing into a pyramid scheme because they start recruiting people to resell the vitamins for them, promising them huge commissions and that they'll all be rich and they can own their own business and all they have to do is pay several $100s up front to get started. Classic MLM nonsense. But over time, the pyramid in their pyramid scheme actually gets huge. From their infomercials, they recruit over 220,000 people to help resell these bullshit multivitamins. And this goes on for several years. And allegedly, Don and Doug Grant's company brings in over $52 million from doing this. So all this success and all this attention, this ends up going great for them. Until eventually the FDA catches on to the claims that Don and Doug Grant are making about these vitamins. And they don't like it. So they issue them several formal warnings to stop saying your vitamins do all this stuff that they don't really do. But Don and Doug Grant, they don't stop. They just keep on running these infomercials and they keep selling. So after years of FDA warnings and customer complaints, Don's cons finally catch up to him because their business gets raided. And eventually all their vitamin websites are taken down and their greatest vitamin in the world business ends up getting dissolved. And ultimately there's a 4-year-long investigation into Don's shady business model. And during this time, his business partner, Doug Grant, he actually goes to prison for unaliving his wife. So That's fun. But after all these investigations and all the evidence they have against him, Don knows he's going down for this vitamin scheme and that he'll likely spend a lot of time in prison. So one day, he just vanishes. Just doesn't show up to his court date. He basically says f*** it, and he goes on the run from the law. But unfortunately for him, about a day later, they find him, hiding out in a local gym. So that didn't work. So they arrest Don and they throw him in jail, and he has to wait there until his trial starts. So there he is. He's facing 41 counts of fraud, and he's potentially looking at 25 years in prison if he gets convicted. And this scares the hell out of him. So one morning, 2 days before his trial, Don, he takes a razor blade and he unalives himself right there in his jail cell.